Hello there. My name is Jonathan Friedman, and you're listening to FAQs by EHN Canada. This is a show where we scour the internet for the most frequently asked questions about mental health and addiction and ask an expert for their answers to them. Today, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our guest, Jason MacKenzie. Jason is a husband, father, and entrepreneur. He's been married to his incredible wife, Tanya, for 12 years and is the proud father of Melody. Jason lost his first wife, Cindy, to suicide in 2010 and his daughter, Chloe, to a car accident in 2023. Jason runs a coaching program for dads who own businesses and a leadership development company as well. Jason is a published author of a book aimed at fathers and talks about grief on his popular TikTok channel. He also writes about grief for men and the people who love them on Substack. Jason, how you doing today?
Hey, Jonathan, I'm doing great and I'm very happy to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Me too. So you're a coach. You have you work in leadership development. You talk about grief. Um, those seem to me like two completely different things. How did you get into both of them?
I worked as a leader for a long time in the corporate world, let's say in automotive manufacturing. And then I became really, after my wife died, I dealt with a lot of addiction issues. And especially once I stopped drinking, I became very interested in helping other people. I just started to learn about what it meant to be a coach and how to coach people. And I went really down that rabbit hole, let's say, and really enjoyed it. But like, I think fundamentally, like with all of these things, whether it's, helping dads, helping leaders, or coaching people on better understanding and evolving themselves, the common thread that runs through it all is relationships. It's the ability to, build a compassionate relationship with ourselves, but it's also the ability to communicate in a way that builds mutually exclusive relationships with other people. And I think one of the even maybe more fundamental common themes is communication. I spend a lot of my time teaching people how to communicate with each other in a way that helps them strengthen the relationship and also, get the things done that they want to get done. So there's actually, I think, a fair amount of commonality between them.
And I think that's really interesting. And do you find that like when you're coaching people, when you're in that hot seat, do you find that like grief is one of those things that gets in the way from leaders, achieving the things that they want to achieve?
Yes, but I would say probably to take it even maybe one level down. I think it's the trauma of the experiences that had in our life, that it is amazing not only how impactful that can be on people's, how what's happened in the past can impact like how we look at things in the present, but also how and especially I have a much more experience coaching. I coach women too, but I coach a lot more men, and it's very interesting. I would say that how little most men that I deal with understand how the things they've experienced are influencing the way they look at. Because what they think is, and I've been this person too, is you have this traumatic experience and you think you can put it in a box and just move on, and of course you can't do that, and it influences it plays out and influences your life, and a lot of times in ways that you don't understand. So it's really fascinating to me, having been in that place, to be able to help people see, yeah, like, look, this thing, whether it was a devastating loss or some other kind of trauma, it's a thread that runs through your whole life that connects what happened to you back then to what's happening to you right now, and helping people, see that link and then start to work to move past it is really, really satisfying.
That's really, really interesting. I saw this visual recently. I have some people in my own life that really, really like they experience a traumatic loss and they really, really struggle with grief. And we were looking at this visual that shows like this circle, and one option is like kind of how we think about grief, like you move past it, but then it shows this one that's the more accurate picture. I'll try and throw it in the description that shows your life here as a circle, but grief, or sorry, grief is the circle and then your life grows around the grief. Like grief is always a part of your story. That loss is always a part of your story. But what are the things you're doing, growing your life and communicating and understanding that grief as a part of it?
I think that's a really great way to put it. I mean, I don't when you lose someone or suffer a devastating loss, whether it's a spouse or child or somebody else that's dear to you, you're going to miss them for the rest of your life. I mean, but it will change over time. And I think of it sometimes as grief is such an unpredictable experience. And so sometimes what happens is, I've kind of likened it to, and I felt this way myself, where it's, I'm standing at the bottom of a mountain and I know to move forward, I have to climb this mountain, but I am so exhausted from climbing the last one. And I know after this mountain, there's going to be another one and another one and another one. But the thing is that if you just keep doing your best to climb those mountains, and when I say climbing a mountain, I mean, deal with the guilt, the shame, the regret, the painful emotions, the sadness, the longing, and you do the work. What happens is those you get stronger, and so while those mountains, they might stay that each mountain you uh, have to climb. Maybe it's the same height, but it feels you're stronger, so you're more capable and you're more able to climb it. So you'll still have to continue to climb these mountains, but you'll be able to do it in a way that's takes less of your life. Because at the beginning, especially immediately in the immediate aftermath of a devastating loss, I mean, it consumes, or at least it has for me and a lot of people, it consumes your entire existence. And moving forward is really about keep still having this painful experience, but to your point, growing around it so it's there and it's with you and it's something you're carrying, but you're just much more capable of carrying it in a way that allows you to build, a meaningful life and find joy again.
Thanks for sharing that, Jason. The audience, for anyone new listening, the way we find these questions is I go and I search for the most frequently asked questions, and thus the name of the show, around a specific topic. We try to break it down in a way that is more understandable than maybe some like really heavily worded blogs or things like that. So today we're talking about grief. It's something that I think is sort of a universal feeling. It's something we've all probably felt in some way, but we all experience it in different ways. And Jason, I'm really, really excited to get into that with you today. So, before we were talking about, and something you've seen especially with men, is, this we've experienced something, we put it in a box over here, and we kind of try to move on. But as we just said, this grief is kind of a big part of us now. That loss is a big part of us. So, how can I start to understand if I'm processing grief in a healthy way, or if maybe when I take a look, I can say, I'm not actually doing it in a healthy way?
Mm, that's a great question. Well, I think grief is a very individual experience, but I think there's some common things that might be instructive to talk about. So, I think you know, first of all, you have to I think it's a question you have to continue to ask yourself over and over and over again because there's a million ways to cope. So you can face grief or you can cope with it. And when I say coping with it, I mean distracting yourself, or, which could be anything. And I'm saying this as someone who has done all of these things, but whether it's drinking, drugs, overworking, isolating yourself, there's all of these things you can do to cope with and distract yourself from grief. But I think you have to ask yourself on an ongoing basis: is what I am doing right now, is it helping me heal? And is it serving me? Is it serving me and the people I love and helping me, uh, you know, um, build a meaningful life? Like, for example, I write a lot about grief, like a lot. And, I ask myself frequently, okay, am I doing this? Like, let me be introspective. And I talk to a therapist about this, but let me be introspective and just and reflect on the reasons that I'm doing this. Are they still serving me? Am I doing this, because or am I too focused on grief? And so it's an ongoing conversation I have with myself and the people that I love about, whether or not the things that I'm doing are actually helping me heal. But fundamentally, if you are doing something to deal with the pain of losing the person you love, you're probably doing something that's harming yourself because the a the pain of loss is over it can be absolutely overwhelming. It can be I mean, in my experience of losing my daughter, it's the most I didn't even know pain like this was possible, you know? And so I I know though that what I have to do to heal is I have to face it. I have when those painful memories come or, again, maybe it's a feeling of, guilt, like failed my daughter, I couldn't save her, for example. The only way to move forward is to sit with that experience. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. But fundamentally, when you're already in pain and then you have a sudden, somebody described this to me once, it's called a stug, a sudden temporary upsurge in grief. When you're already in pain, the pain can feel intolerable. The desire to escape it, even if it's just for like a few minutes, can be overwhelming. And when you find yourself doing that, you have to know that this is and you might continue to make that choice, but you have to know that ultimately, even though I'm seeking relief right now, this is probably not going to help me move forward. And it doesn't mean you're always going to make the right choice. There's times in since my daughter died, not recently, but I mean, I give you an example. I hadn't smoked marijuana for a long time before my daughter died. I used to smoke it a lot, and when she died, I made it about 4 months. And I was having an anxiety attack, and we were in like a public setting at a festival, and there's just so many people around, and I just could not take it anymore. I literally could not take it, and I just went and I went to the cannabis store, bought a couple joints and got high. And I knew that that was not serving me in that moment. I just could not. I was done with being able to take it. But I also knew that having been through some of what I'd been through before with alcohol, I knew that I had to treat it as a temporary reprieve, and I had to get back. I had to get back to sobriety as soon as possible, which I did do. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fundamentally the short answer to your question is if you're doing something to distract yourself from facing the pain of losing the person you lost, it's almost guaranteed that it is not serving you.
I really appreciate you sharing all of that. What are some things that we can notice in ourselves, like, you know, uh, when I think of like my time as a social worker, I used to think of like the tells. Like I know this person's becoming a little more anxious, but internally, what can we look at in ourselves, our own tells, where we can say, "I feel that." You called it a stug, or you feel that elation inside of you. That might be pushing you um, to look for temporary relief.
That's a great question. I think if I've learned anything, it's to that we can all be so we would all be so much better off if we were more in tune with what is happening in our body. So we tend to live, it's me included, we tend to live in our heads. So what'll happen is we'll have an uncomfortable feeling in our body. And then what we'll do is in our heads, we'll make meaning about what that means. So I'll feel some sense of discomfort. Maybe there's a trigger, like I see a picture of my daughter. Then I feel this really uncomfortable feeling in my body. And then I make meaning about that. Oh my God, I miss my daughter so much. I'm never going to see her again, et cetera, et cetera. And then that leads to, or could lead to, depending on what kind of meaning I make of it and the story I tell myself, that leads to maybe somebody wanting to cope with that or whatever. But I think that one of the most important things I've learned, and through going something through called somatic experiencing therapy, is that if you actually just pay attention, if you just sit and pay attention to what is happening in your body, the charge or that feeling of discomfort, it is amazing how quickly it will actually pass. So I think that the advice I give to people a lot of the time now is, you know, it's first of all, seek out a somatic experiencing practitioner. That's been really great for me, and I'm really a big fan of it. But it's really to to try to sit with and become more intentional about what's happening in your body without making meaning out of it. Just experience what's happening in your body, and it's amazing how fast it'll pass. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I mean, I find that has been life changing for me.
It sounds like professional support was a big part of like how you learned to really attune yourself to those feelings. Could we talk a bit about you call it somatic experience
Mhm.
therapy?
Yeah.
So, like, uh, what is that?
Yeah, great question. So, now keep in mind, I'm kind of a baby here, so, but there's a book called actually by the person, who invented somatic experiencing therapy. It's called Waking the Tiger, and it's this really amazing, overview of this practice. But fundamentally, the idea is that when we suffer traumatic experience, um, you hear sometimes you hear people say things like, trauma can get stuck in your body or you get caught in this loop. So what happens is you have like a traumatic experience. So saying, I'll just speak for myself, losing my daughter. And so what happens is then, of course, after that happens, uh, I have a lot of really intense emotional experiences. Again, like sadness, regret, anger, whatever. But the thing is that they there's a trigger, but then they start in your body basically, right? So what somatic experiencing tells you to do, well, so then what most people will do is, so let's say I have this really, really, really uncomfortable feeling come up my body. Then again, like I was just saying, I'll make meaning of it. But then what I'll try to do is I'll try to manage the charge. So I'll go into like fight or flight, and then like a sense of hypervigilance. And then what I try to do is I try to manage the charge. So I might try to distract myself from it. Again, this is where all these coping mechanisms come in. But what happens is you're not allowing this charge that comes up to actually just naturally regulate and be released. And so you basically end up getting caught in this loop where you're never letting this, they call it a charge because it's a neutral terminology. Like it's not like you can call it anxiety or whatever, but charge is neutral. So somatic experiencing is about when that charge comes up, it's connecting to your felt sense and really sitting with it and saying, okay, what am I noticing in my body? Well, I feel like I feel like a band of tension across my chest. And, where does that, and it kind of inserts at my shoulders. And, oh, now it's moving and it's actually like moving down my body. And so it's paying attention to that charge. And what happens is that when you do that and you're not telling yourself a story about it, all you're doing is like examining what's happening in your body, the charge will regulate and release. And then all of a sudden, you're it's past and you're in a much calmer state. And in that state, the amount of the insights that I have had anyways are just immensely powerful. Like the first time I did somatic experiencing, we did this for about 10 minutes. I mean, it wasn't even in a row. It was 5 minutes and then it was another, then we talked about it, and then it was another 5 minutes. And after the second 5 minutes of him just guiding me through what was connecting to my body, I started bawling my head off. And I went upstairs after the session and slept for 12 hours. Like, because what happened was I have been in so much stuff since my wife died and since my daughter died, I've been in a state of hypervigilance, like as a way of protecting myself from a threat, like not a physical threat, but like emotional threat, like a horrible memory or whatever. And so somatic experiencing actually let me drop out of that fight or flight or hypervigilance down back into like a sustainable range. And when that happened, I just became completely exhausted, went and slept for 12 hours. So, but I've also realized, yeah, I mean, that's fundamentally how it works. And it, even after having done it for about 8 or 9 months, I still find myself wondering how actually it's like, is this effective? But it's a very, very powerful experience. And the reason I sought it out is because I've seen over the years, I've seen therapists a number of times, and I'm a very introspective person. I like to, learn a lot and do a lot of reading, and I came therapy is super valuable. But for me, after my daughter died, I saw a therapist, a traditional sort of talk psychotherapist for a few months, and I really had this resistance to it because, and again, it's not me. It's not a commentary on the therapy in general at all. Just that I felt like I don't need to talk about this anymore. Like I get it, and I don't know how much going over all this is going to be useful to me. I really felt called to find something else. And serendipitously, literally, I don't believe in coincidences anymore, but like just a couple days later, I listened to a podcast with somebody talking about somatic experiencing. And I thought, wow, I think I'm going to try that. And so I did. And it's really been a very life changing thing.
It's incredible, and I really believe that one like one size doesn't fit all, which has become a cliche, but especially in mental health, there are, sort of traditional talk therapists. There's things like somatic experiencing therapy. There's a whole spectrum of systems and care, and it's a really big emerging field. And if something doesn't work the first, second, third time, but you're interested and like you're looking for that support, it's okay to get creative and like ask for different kinds of support, because there is something out there that will work, that will help to like lower those feelings, like you were talking before about that fight or flight. When we experience trauma and we're experiencing that high level of stress, anxiety, that fight or flight moment, we're not actually able to, like, our brain doesn't have the time or space to actually process feelings. And it sounds like that's what this therapy was really powerful thing you start to do. So I really appreciate that, Jason.
Yeah, and I think you hit on something that's important there, because I agree with what you said 100%. I mean, grief, we're all unique individuals. Grief is a completely, there's some commonalities, but it's a very unique experience. Not only because we're unique, but because the relationship we had with the person that we lost is unique. And so, um, and I've always made, since my daughter died, I have made a very sacred commitment to myself that I'm going to turn over every stone on the path to healing. And that involves exploring all kinds of different things, and if it feels good and it feels like something I want to continue to do, I'm going to do it. But to your point, there's just so many different ideas, methodologies, approaches that are available, and I think we owe it to ourselves, and to the people left behind, not to die along with the person that we loved who died. We're still here, and I hear so many parents, especially people who comment on some of the TikTok videos I make. I hear so many parents who've lost kids, especially who refer to themselves as permanently broken. And I'm a huge believer in the idea that the words we use don't describe our reality, they define it. So you need to be very, very intentional about what you're boldly speaking into existence. Because if you describe yourself as permanently broken, you're going to really heighten the chances of being permanently broken. And so I'm a huge believer in the idea that, I've always been, even in some of the darkest moments, I've always known that I will continue to heal. I've always remained optimistic about the future, even though I know that uh, for the rest of my life, I will have moments of really intense pain, probably, And but having said that, I think of it like that Japanese art of kintsugi, where that you break a piece of pottery and then they put it back together, but they use like beautiful gold flakes or glue or whatever. So it's reassembled and it's different, but it's still beautiful. It's just beautiful in a different way than it originally was intended to be. And I think healing from grief is a lot like that. We can still rebuild a beautiful, meaningful life, even though it is a lot different than the one we imagined before the person we love died.
Yeah, yeah. Um the there's two things that stuck out to me. Like I grew up with my stepmom who always she wrote a book called What You Focus on Grows, and that whole piece, like what you're talking about all the time over and over and over again, it really works to define you, and the language you use is really important. Which as an anxious dude is kind of trippy because you can't help but think those things, but it's
Right.
part of to do it. And the other piece is, yeah, kintsugi is so beautiful, and the idea I think has a lot of parallels to grief, and being permanently broken. Because, like in that art, in that example, the pottery, the dish is cracked, it is broken, but now it's put together in a new way that is beautiful too. Um, let's talk about one more piece here, which is grief doesn't go away per se. It can resurface in different ways over years. So, how does one handle sort of that emerging, re-emerging, delayed response of grief? Is that something you've experienced yourself? Um, how can you process that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and absolutely. Because I mean, gr- grief changes obviously as you change, but it changes with the passage of time. And so the grief that I experienced or that one might experience, in the immediate aftermath of a devastating loss is different than the grief that you'll experience 2 or 3 or 10 years later, and so you might think, I think of it a lot like the metaphor I like to use about this is imagine the when you lose a person you love, it's like a stake is driven into the ground at that moment. If they are frozen in time at the moment that they die, but you keep rushing ahead into the future. And so, and it's like you're attached to that stake with a million elastic bands of different sizes and strengths, and you never know when they're going to snap. So like an example might be, let's say, in my case, one of the first times this happened was when my wife died. My daughter had my older daughter who has now passed away too, but at the time she was 6. She had a loose tooth, and the tooth didn't fall out for like 4 months, so it was loose before my wife died. And that moment it fell out, it was like, wow, something just happened here that Cindy will never get to see. Snap! It was like an elastic band snapping, or oh, it's the anniversary of her death, or it's like the kids are going to school, or many years later, it was. I don't even know when they were maybe 14 and 15. I don't even know if my wife saw them on the street. If she was to come back to life and saw them on the street, I don't even know if she would recognize them anymore. Snap, and so and because they're all different, these elastic bands, these metaphorical elastic bands are all different sizes and shapes. You don't know when they're going to snap, and it always hurts when they do. So first of all, it's unpredictable. Second of all, it's always painful to a certain extent. And I think, I mean, it sounds probably trite, but I think you have to accept that that's how grief is. You know, you don't, I mean, my wife died 15 years ago. And, you know, when my daughter died, I was fairly, I would say I healed quite a lot from that. I mean, I didn't think about it that much anymore, but there were still times when I would go visit her grave. The vast majority of the time, like, I wouldn't be overly emotional. Sometimes I would feel nothing, and then out of the blue, I would go visit her grave, and I would just become incredibly emotional, and really miss her, and many, many years after, and so I think understanding that I think the key is accepting grief for what it is, and it is a way of, I mean, it's obviously a way related to the connection you had to that person, but it's not linear. There's not a even those, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, you know, people think they're linear, like you go from one step to the next step, and I remember listening to a podcast with, one of her proteges, David Kessler, and he was saying that at the end of her life, one of the things that really, really troubled her was that people had turned this 5 stages into grief into like this ladder, like or this linear progression, and that was never what her intention was for it to be. And so I think accepting that it is unpredictable and that it is going to those elastic bands are going to snap for a long time, and that when they do, that is just part of the process of, and it's just something that we have to understand is coming, and do our very best to sit with and face in the moment. And I wish there was a great magical answer for it, like to but that's I think accepting it is really the first thing, because it can be very, very, especially for me and a lot of people I talk to, knowing when you have one of these, sudden temporary episodes of grief, knowing it's going to happen again and again and again, and you don't know when, and you don't know how intense it's going to be. I mean, just the thought of that is overwhelming, you know. But I think too that it's really, really important as you heal to find ways to stay connected and to make meaning from the life and death of your loved one in ways that are like in ways other than pain. you know, there's lots of ways you can stay connected to them, whether it's trying to make a difference in the world or building, helping somebody else or building something or what. There's a million ways where you can make meaning. But I think what happens in a lot of people, is you can really get stuck into creating this story that the amount of pain that I feel tells me how much I loved that person, and that's if you fall into that trap, I'll call it. I mean, um, you're always going to feel pain, but it can't be the only way you feel that connection to that person, because if you fall in that trap, it's going to be really hard to break out of it. So, um, not sure if that answers your question, but that's what I got.
Well, I think it does. I think I resonate a lot with the latter. It's like, okay, you're like, let's say you're going to therapy. Let's say you're reading that book. There are steps in quotes for those who are listening, um, to grief. And then when you finish those steps, grief is over. Grief is finished. But it is nonlinear and it is complex. And every time it will show its face, it can bring up a lot of different things. And it's less about being able to, level up through grief and more about, building your emotional resilience and your ability to ride the storm and handle those waves and understand that I lost somebody who's important to me and there are feelings that are associated with that. And that can happen on a Tuesday or it can happen in 5 years from now, out of nowhere. Um, but it's a part of the deal in a way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And a couple things you said there that stood out to me. Like one is, I agree with you. Resilience to me is a set of skills that you can learn, and it's really helpful to start learning the skills to be resilient before something really, really tragic happens, because it's really hard to learn them. When you're in the midst of grief. But something else you said, about the stages not being linear, is that um, it's like acceptance, acceptance being one of the stages. Well, I think when I was younger, I thought acceptance was like flipping a switch. You don't accept something, boom. Okay, then you have this moment of insight or growth and you accept it. But I don't think that's how it is. I think it's a continuum where as you grow and heal and do the work, there's you over time spend more time being able to accept it. But it doesn't mean maybe there's a point in the future, yeah, there probably is, where okay, I fully accept it now, but getting to that spot is going from, I can't believe this happened, I cannot accept this, to accepting it, and then that happening, not accepting it and accepting it, and then hoping as you move along this continuum that you just spend, more and more and more time being able to accept it than, feeling, trapped in the turmoil and angst of not being able to accept it. And again, maybe, you get to a point of being able to like fully accept it at some point, but it takes it's a looping, meandering journey to get there.
Absolutely. So today we spent a good chunk of time talking about sort of internal resources, the journey. We've spoken about some professional resources, in this case, somatic experiencing therapy. I'd love to talk a bit about non-professional supports. Like, what role does community, do friends, does family play in the grieving process? Both like as characters in your life, but also as support structures for you.
That is a great question, because I think that one of the reasons I'm glad we're doing this podcast is because in our Western culture, grief, it's wild for me to think about the fact that grief is such a universal human experience, and that we are so ill-equipped to talk about it and relate to it when it happens. And I think one of the experiences that a lot of people have when you suffer devastating loss is feeling profoundly let down by people that you thought would show up. I mean, I've had people in my life very close to me who have never mentioned my daughter's death, and they I don't think they're bad people. They don't know what to do, and they're afraid of making, if I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, they're afraid of making it worse. They don't want to bring it up in case it triggers some memory. And so what ends up happening is it never gets talked about. And so a lot of people can feel very, very resentful about how the people in their lives that they thought would show up, um, will have let them down. So, that's just a something I want to put out there, because it's a very common experience out here for people. But to answer your question is, I like from I'll talk about myself, for example. I have my business partners I work with, who are incredible guys, and they're all, emotionally intelligent and communicative, and just deeply value their relationships. And the way they have leaned, allowed me to been there for me and allowed me to lean into them, and always there to talk to me, has been life changing. So I think that, having a group of people in your life that you can have those conversations with is wonderful. However, you have to be willing to lean into them as well, and so that can be very hard for people to do, especially for men when they are struggling with something, and it can be very hard to, let down your guard and say, "Hey, I'm really struggling with this," because you tell yourself all kinds of stories. "Oh, this makes me weak," or "I've talked about this so many times, nobody wants to hear about this again," and I should, or you judge yourself, "I should have moved on by now." So I think having a group of people, in your life that you can have those conversations with is critically important. And if you don't have them now, my encouragement to you is to go develop those kinds of relationships with people, because there's a quote, I forget who made it, but you average of the five people you spend the most time with. And I mean, it's the most, having a solid group of people like that in my life that, I can call my band of brothers, let's say. It's been absolutely life changing. So, being really intentional about the relationships that you develop and the people that you allow into your inner circle, I think is really important when it comes to healing from grief. And then, of course, there's all kinds of, resources available. Like, one of the groups I'm a member of is a group called. So there's a I'm trying to think of the main organization now. It's actually just escaping me, but I think it's called Helping Parents Heal, actually, and it's out of the United States, and it's a huge group of where they run like grief support groups for parents who've lost kids. Another group that's just like a subgroup of that is Helping Fathers Heal. So being a part of that group, and just, you know being with other people who can have walked a mile in your shoes, and but also people that are, further along the journey, where you can see that there's hope, that there is, for some of the guys that come in and they're like a couple months in, they're devastated. They can't even imagine, uh, how they're even going to make it through tomorrow, much less, into the future. But then seeing, men, or in case of, women, just seeing people who are 4, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, and that they're there, and that they've been able to start rebuilding their life, and that they're helping other people, who like, they're helping people who are maybe just, more recently after suffering a loss, it gives you hope. And I think that's hugely important, because even though grief is like this universal human experience, it's somehow at the same time one of the most lonely things you can go through, because somehow we feel like, again, people don't know how to talk about it. And support people going through it. And so it can feel incredibly lonely. So I think, recognizing that, first of all, if you suffered a devastating loss, there's basically no chance that you are going to be able to heal, and, start to rebuild a meaningful life on your own. I don't even see how that's really possible, unless you try to do what I did after my wife and stuff it down and try to drink it away, which is certainly not a path to a meaningful life. But I just don't see how it's possible to do that alone. How you can make sense of everything, and how you can, resolve like all the things that come up in your head, and, how you can let go of the guilt, all those things. I don't know how I could not do it on my own. So, having a good group of friends around me, but also being intentional about going to places, whether it's a community group, like in your local community. We have those in town here too, where I live. And you probably do, if your community is reasonably sized, there's probably a support group of some kind. But just being intentional about going to be with other people that have shared your experience, where you can just open up and barf out your feelings and thoughts, and, be met with compassion and understanding.
That's incredible, Jason. That there's, I think grief is a great example, as you said, of like, it's something that's so universal, yet it's so isolating, and accessing, yes, absolutely professional supports, but also like looking at your community close, like your band of brothers, as you called them, and also the other community peer supports that are available can help model what going through grief can and might be better to look like or different to look like, but also to have that safe place to express and share and feel less isolated, which is really, really, really important. Um, Before we close out today, I just like, what's your call to action to people who, might have just gone through, something significant, a significant loss, they're experiencing grief, and they're just not sure what to do.
Mm. So I think my call to action is when you are in the immediate aftermath of a devastating loss, sometimes when the pain is so intense, the best thing you can hope to do is just not do things to make it worse than it already is. And there are a million things you can do to make it worse than it already is. And so, I think that's just super important. So it's just doing your best to uh, stay away from all those coping mechanisms, all those coping mechanisms that prevent you from actually grieving and actually cause more destruction. But also knowing that everybody has a limit. Everyone has a limit of how much they can take, and if you find yourself turning to those, don't one of the things we can do to make it worse is just beating ourselves up for making mistakes or doing things. And so if you find yourself in a spot where you're coping in a way where it's not helping you, you're never going to hate yourself to healing. So, it's really about continually trying to come back to a path that will help you move forward. And, sometimes we stumble and we take a knee, and that's normal because, again, there's only so much of a load that we're all capable of carrying. And so if you find yourself in those spot where you're doing those things or, maybe making some decisions that are, you know, you think might be helping you in the short term, but are really hurting you in the long term. It's just to try to be self-compassionate and be honest about it. Come back to the path, and as many times as it takes for you to continue to move forward. I mean, and I think the other thing too is just to realize that this is an experience that um, you can't really prepare yourself for. I mean, I guess you can prepare yourself for it, but it's so overwhelming that it's really, really hard to navigate it in a way and make sense and process it all. And to the point we were talking about earlier, the sooner you can get some support and start talking through and just being a little bit more open about the experience, the better off you're going to be. Because isolating yourself and pretending you can put it in a box and lock it down is not going to work. So I think those would be my two calls to action is self-compassion and getting around people who can relate to you and want to you know uh, extend a hand to you and help lift you up out of the pit that you're in.
Thanks so much for that, Jason. And in the description, we're going to link to some really great resources about like exactly that, like peer support groups, treatment, so on and so forth. Jason, just before we close off for today, where can people find you? Where can people connect with you? Every morning I wake up on LinkedIn and I see something new from you.
Yeah, so well, I write on Substack a lot, and you can find me on Substack at mandown.help. And there I write a lot about grief for men and the people who love them. And I have some free guides that I've developed. One is for men specifically. One is for leaders. I'm on TikTok at jason.s.mackenzie, MacKenzie. And if you look for Jason MacKenzie on LinkedIn or Facebook, I write a lot about grief on there as well. And so you can find me there. And if you seek me out and you ever want to reach out to me, please do. I love hearing people's stories and seeing how I can help them individually. So I'll always get back to you as soon as I can.
Jason, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thanks.